Gogerty.
My name is Nicola, aka Socrates, and you're watching Singularity One-on-One. If you guys enjoy this show, you can help me make it better in two different ways. Number one is you can go on iTunes and leave a review. And number two is you can come to singularityweblog.com and simply make a donation. Today, my guest on the show is Nick Gogerty. Nick is the founder of Thoughtful Capital Group, who has worked with one of the world's largest hedge funds. He was also a chief analyst at StarLab, which was a deep future multidisciplinary science research institute. Most recently, Nick has launched the SolarCoin Foundation, believing that solar power should be more incentivized than it currently is. So, Nick Gogerty, welcome to Singularity One-on-One.
Thank you, Nicola.
Fantastic. Nick, I'm very excited to have you here.
Great.
Because you have an absolutely fascinating personal biography, lots of diversified experience in what sounds like kind of not incompatible, but very different fields.
Right.
And you have a very interesting recent project. So let's start one step at a time.
Okay.
Can you please start our conversation by perhaps introducing yourself in your own few words?
Sure. I am a person who likes to study big problems and then try to build solutions that are highly scalable and highly leveraged to them. And those problems and solutions usually resolve around information, and they fall into three areas. One are social problems. So as an undergrad, I studied cultural anthropology and sustainable economic development, focusing on West Africa. Technology, which is all about information and how you organize and apply it, becoming ever more important. And then the third one is finance and economics. And economics is really nothing more than the intersection of the two, where you understand how people behave and act and structure, and then you abstract it into the quantitative realm.
Absolutely fascinating. So you started with anthropology and then you kind of went into all those diverse fields.
Correct.
How did you end up in StarLab? And by the way, tell us, for those of our viewers who may not be familiar with that institution, tell us a little bit more about it.
Sure. StarLab was a privately funded European deep future science research institute, and it was modeled on the MIT Media Lab. And so on the board of directors was Nicholas Negroponte, who was effectively the founder of the Media Lab, and two Nobel laureates. Inside StarLab were 70 to 80 PhD projects, research projects. Now, the mandate for StarLab was a place where 100 years means nothing. And the thinking was a deep future research institute. And so the areas of science included, and my role there was chief analyst, to give you perspective as one of the senior management teams. We had science across most of the, disciplines. So there were the physical sciences, there was nanotech, materials sciences, research into that area. There were the software sciences. So I was overseeing 3 schools of artificial intelligence. At one point, we had the world's largest artificial brain there, according to the Guinness Book of World Records. Software, and then there was biology as well, which involved projects, everything from gathering gene samples, and this is back in 2000, when this is pretty, cutting edge stuff, gathering gene samples for what was supposed to have been the largest phenotypic database of gene samples, as well as there's research into protein folding, artificial liver growth, you name an area of interesting science, we're asking questions. Even Time travel was on the list. And it was a theoretical one. And people used to come by and ask VCs, especially, and others, and private industry in our consortium, okay, what are we doing here? And the interesting thing was, and the response was, time travel is an interesting piece of research. It was purely mathematical. And so it was in the theoretical realm. But the same thing, if we go back, let's say, to the 1900s, quantum physics was purely a theoretical thing. It was all equations and physicists at the turn of the century. You fast forward to today, and the quantum phenomena found in every transistor, and almost most of the applied information tools we use is, a huge part of our economy. So interesting questions were being asked by very, very bright people there. And my role was to help capture those things, capture the IP, and then help package them for potential businesses. So very, very profoundly interesting area in Brussels.
So was it fair to say, because you said capture the IP and spin out businesses or something, so was it fair to say that that's kind of an incubator for future science or something?
Correct. I mean, Starlab, the nature of it was a laboratory for deep future research where the researchers were supposed to be the stars, effectively, and it was an incubator, and that was exactly the operating model. It had two models, three. One was an incubator for new ideas to do spin-offs. The second was a research consortium model, modeled on the MIT Media Lab. And then the third one was doing direct contract research. So research for ESA, the European Space Administration, and other, let's say, private contract research, all housed outside of Brussels and in Barcelona. And Starlab still goes on, actually, in Barcelona.
Yeah, because I was going to say, so what happened? It sounds like an absolutely fascinating project that we desperately need. And
yes, one of my learnings. Again, I teach at Columbia Business School and have learned a few things about what things don't work. Is that what's called fundamental research? There are three types of let's say research. You start with fundamental, then you go to applied, and then you go to commercial. And each one of those, you take a phenomena and then you scale it out to an end user benefit. Fundamental research, which is what's going on at Starlab, really understanding fundamental dynamics of a thing, to make it all the way out to the commercial path, really has to happen at the nation state. And what I mean by that is, if I find something interesting in the lab, the chances that I can then make it into a thing, maybe 1 in 10. And then the chances that I can make that thing into a commercial company, a viable incubator company, the commercialization, maybe 1 in 20, 1 in 50. And so what ends up happening is the number of, let's say, bets at the fundamental level required is extremely large. You need a very, very large portfolio of bets. And Starlab raised over $90 million, but it wasn't large enough to do it. And even Paul Allen at Interval Research in the 90s tried the same thing with $400 million. So my conclusion is that to do fundamental research to harvest the economic returns on it almost has to happen at either the university or almost nation state level, so that you can ask thousands of interesting questions that then end up percolating through an economy.
So that's an absolutely fascinating story at Skylab there, Nick. And so was the hedge fund experience before or after? And how is that even lined together?
Right. I'm interested in information and problem solving. And so I have a deep finance background that actually started when I was 17 years old. I started trading yen futures. In college for fun, I had a software startup and was doing research with neural networks and genetic algorithms for bond trading. So the finance has always been there. And finance, again, looking for leverage to problems, there's almost very, very few areas where you can take information and convert it into value more than in finance and economics. And so I was interested in understanding that. And so my roles in finance have been everything from a quantitative foreign exchange dealer for one of the world's largest banks in London to working for a small hedge fund in New York studying renewable energy, as well as working with what's arguably one of the world's largest hedge funds that's very influential in macroeconomic approaches.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. And then, so we know that you have interest in science. We know that you have interest in data and in foreign exchange and things like that, in economics, and in converting ideas from, let's say, the fundamental to the applied level and then to the commercial level.
Correct.
Now, where do we bring the cryptocurrency sort of, and how do they fit? How did you discover them? And
excellent question. In the following way, a colleague of mine asked me once at a conference. He was discussing fundamentals of a civilization or society, and he said, "Well, one of the fundamentals is energy." And that's basic. And we were talking. It was an economic conference. We were talking about, could you base a currency on energy or electricity? Now, this is a concept that's been around for a long time. Even Henry Ford at the 1920s proposed things. To really do that, you have to understand what a currency is and how it works. And I will tell you this: money is a weird thing. Currency is a weird thing. I worked with currency. Started trading yen futures at 17. Worked for one of the world's largest banks. in my 20s, worked with the world's largest hedge fund, blah, blah, blah. Didn't really understand currency probably until about 5 years ago when I wrote my book. Okay, and I'll get into what that is, but I just want to say that it's a little bit stranger than people think, because it's a little bit like electricity. Most people don't know how it works. It just does for them.
And just for the record, your book is called The Nature of Value.
Correct. The Nature of Value, put out by Columbia University Press. So I guest lecture there, and it's an Ivy League school, one of the top 5 or 10 in the world. And yes, so the currency thing is the following. My colleague and I came up with a concept of how do you back an energy with currency in 2011, published a white paper. And the thinking was to use something called energy forwards and let's say forward claims on energy for a typical central bank to buy these things and keep them as assets, the same way a central bank currently uses treasury bonds or other instruments, debt instruments. The thinking was that as a currency, as an economy overheats or slows down, like we have an economic slowdown, what would happen is the price or the price of energy would go in the opposite way and act as a stabilizer on the currency. So if the economy gets really, really hot, let's say China is going crazy and it's getting overheated and overgrowth, the currency and the demand for energy would increase such that it would slow the economy down to a stable way. Mm-hmm. Consequently, if the economy was experiencing a slowdown, the cost of energy would potentially decrease. The currency would decrease as well, and this would help make things cheaper and then help stimulate the economy. That was the thinking behind it. Okay, that was 2011. One of the things you have to do to perform an experiment like that is have a central bank. Didn't have one of those. So we fast forward to the Bitcoin era, and that's an interesting thing because one can release a currency or create something in the wild. And so put these concepts together and realize that the way a currency works is it functions via something in economics which is known as a positive externality, i.e. You're getting more out of something or a different aspect of something than one would expect. Currency in and of itself, I'm going to go kind of deep here if you don't mind, currency of
Absolutely.
itself doesn't actually have value. And this is a wild concept for people, but it's paper, it's bits of metal, it's things. And this is all in my book. However,
it's a consensus.
Exactly right. It's a consensus, and I describe currency as a social protocol. It's one that you and I accept. We speak the same protocol. So I give you $1, you know there's $1. We agree that that represents some form of value. $10 and you get 3 chickens or whatever it is. And it's a network effect. Now, this is a very interesting thing because it begs the question, so where does currency get its value? If I can't redeem it, why does it happen to be worth something? Even gold has, it's a metal, but it's not that interesting. Its function is basically lots of poor people dig it out of the ground and then rich people put it back into the ground, into vaults. Yes. Okay, so the currency works in the following way. It's a network, it's almost a network protocol. The interesting thing is, like, let's say imagine the fax protocol. If more than one person has a fax machine, there's value there. If only you and I had a fax machine, that protocol wouldn't be worth much. When millions of people had it, that was worth a lot more. It works the same way with most other protocols, TCP/IP on the internet being the most ubiquitous one globally. So here's what happens. If you take a look at what's called the market cap for Bitcoin or dollars or gold, the value of the entire outstanding stuff, and let's say we'll normalize it to dollars, divide it by the estimate of the number of people who are willing to accept that stuff. So many people would accept a piece of gold if I showed it to them. Many people would accept $1. Bitcoin is accepted by, depending on who you ask, between 1.5 to 2 million people. Here's the interesting thing. Every node on that network, every person, is worth between $1,000 and $2,000. The value in a currency comes from two elements, two what are called economic utility functions. One is speculative. You or someone else is buying it because they think it's going to go up or down. They're selling it, which is less interesting. It's very volatile. And the more interesting aspect is called what I call a network or a transactional utility function. If I think I can sell this or I can trade it for something else, the degree to which I have choices, the more choices across the network to exchange this thing, the more utility it has. Therefore, the more value it represents. It's not actually value, but it represents that. So the interesting thing with these currencies is there's this external value that gets created by the sheer value of people accepting them. Now, that's a weird tautological thing for a lot of people. what ends up happening is because you have this positive externality, you can do interesting things with it. And so that's where we came up with SolarCoin. Launched a currency that is backed, or represents rather, 1 megawatt hour per unit. Now, one of the challenges in a currency is, how do you get it out there? How do you get it out there and grow a network of people who accept it? And they need to have two things. One, they have to assume that it was fairly distributed in an equitable manner. The second thing is, everyone's worried about hyperinflation, or that's what kills currency. There's too much of it. Okay, Bitcoin solves that. Other currencies which are restricted algorithmically. For our currency, what we decided is, let's, instead of using proof of work, algorithmic work for Bitcoin, use proof of real world physical work. If you can show me that you produced 1 megawatt hour of solar energy, we'll give you this coin free. It's a grant. This grows our network. It's interesting in a few ways. The network of participants is pretty much going to stick around for 20 to 30 years. If you have panels on your roof and I'm giving you free currency cheaply every time you can just show, hey, I generated X. This is a reward. Okay, it's a solar reward. You're likely to stay with the network. So we grow the network. So that's what is going on with SolarCoin. The amount of rewards that are currently held and waiting to be distributed is about 1.8 to $2 billion. That's US dollars. Our largest claimant to date in the US has claimed about $1,200 worth of these things. So as the network grows, the value will grow. It'll become very interesting. On top of SolarCoin, and that's a lot of stuff there, I'm just going to mention one other project we're just launching. It's called Electric Chain. The electric chain is going to sit on top of the SolarCoin blockchain. And blockchain is just a database, really. It's just a database that's a logical versus a physical thing. And we're going to try and record as much information from the 7 million solar power generators in the world as possible. Now, this is really interesting for the following reason. It's a public science project we're creating. Every solar panel is effectively a diode, or an eye looking up at the sky. And it can tell you how much sunlight's coming in. To the degree that there's variance from the expected sunlight, you can make estimates of pollution. You can do other things. So on top of the SolarCoin, which right now is the world's largest private sector solar reward system, we're going to be building on top of that what should be the world's largest open source science project for potentially gathering information from these 7 million solar energy generators. So we're chasing talks with MIT, NASA, Reuters, universities, and inverter manufacturers, the people who make the gear, because most solar panels already push out the data of how much electricity they generate over the internet using IP. So we have two things that are really interesting there. Potentially the world's largest solar energy incentive system, this reward system, which is designed for 40 years globally. It's already being deployed in 17 countries. And the just to be launched electricchain.org project, which strives to be the world's largest open public science experiment. And so anyone who wants to publish their data to it, and we can verify that, gets a SolarCoin as well.
Wow. That's absolutely fascinating. So there's many threads I want to grab here, but for the moment, I just want to step back a little bit and ask you, when did you get interested in solar power, per se?
I got interested in it, if you look at any society, energy is a key construct. It just powers everything. I mean, that's okay. Energy is crucial, and the most interesting aspects of energy are sustainable ones. I got interested in solar first when I was at Starlab, because we had one of the research projects back in 2000 was flexible solar cells in our materials sciences lab. I found solar interesting for a few reasons as a renewable energy. So we cut out all the other energies in that it's distributed. And it doesn't have to be large projects. The individual and the eventual rise of, let's say, with cheap storage, you'll have microgrids, the individual house, etc. And so it's a far more interesting energy strategy, and most likely part of the energy future going forward, because it's decentralized. If we look at things, and the world is becoming more about networks, overlapping networks, thinking in networks, and tendency towards decentralization, the one energy form that is solar energy coupled with cheap storage. We're not there yet on the storage, but the cool thing about technologies, and this is every technology, and this is mentioned in my book, is almost all technologies have a Moore's law. And this is a weird thing. And it works, and this is from the Nature of Value book. Every doubling of the production of units of a thing causes a curve in production cost. Every time we ship 2 times more watts of solar energy, so I ship 2x more panels, the cost drops 18 to 22%. In energy, that's wild.
Wow.
Now, this phenomena is very strange because it's basically everything has an innovation curve, and this works for beer, PVC plastic, metals, etc. The more stuff or valuable stuff that gets processed through the economic machine, and we're constantly adding information and innovating, everything gets cheaper. And you can see these, there are a series of curves published at the Santa Fe Institute in the US. There's the performance database curves. It's like 80 or 90 things over 20 or 30 years. And you can see each one has a Moore's law. Even in terms of performance, engines, right? So if you plot out the engine performance, the compression ratio of an engine from car engine from 1900 to today, it'll have a Moore's law equivalent. I'll give you just a quick story here that's interesting about technology and evolution. Again, this is from the book. In 1953, the U.S. panicked, right? There was Sputnik. And so some of the, before Sputnik, the U.S. had what was kind of the precursor to DARPA. And they asked some researchers about human modes of transportation and the rate at which they were accelerating. Okay. And so some of the scientists, either the Rand Institute or one of the others, plotted out on a curve how fast we could go from horses to steam engines, blah, 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 up to cars. They projected a curve out and they said, well, according to this, within 4 years, we will be able to leave the Earth's atmosphere. We'll have enough velocity in mankind. The interesting thing was the curve effectively intersected and predicted Sputnik. Now, they didn't interpret it, but all of a sudden when they went back and looked at the curve, they said, wow. And it roughly lined up within 1 to 2 years of when we landed on the moon, regards to the velocity. So everything follows these fascinating logarithmic curves, which is a very, very wild concept when you think about it. We're along for we're all along in this incredible process of evolving curves. And I can go into more depth on that. There are hints about it in the book and something called phi M and etc.
Yeah, this is all fascinating, and I may come back to it later in our conversation. But in the meantime, I also want to bring a paper into our conversation.
Correct.
In addition to your book, actually provides the theoretical basis, the fundamental theory behind the solar currency, if you will.
Correct.
And it's called DECO, an electricity-backed currency proposal. And I just want to read the thesis here for the benefit of our audience, which goes like this, quote, "The DECO thesis is that electrical energy is the unit form of delivered kilowatt hours. Mm-hmm. A DECO can be a more stable asset for backing a currency than gold or debt. A DECO-backed currency can offer a combination of stable value together with economic utility that neither debt-backed nor gold-backed currency can offer." End quote.
Correct. And that thinking was on the following. A debt-backed currency can be potentially debased by the overissuance of debt. And that's one thing. Now, debt has an infinite utility. You can spend it for buying anything. But then we look at the other option, which is gold. Gold can't be overissued, so it's stable. But its utility is fairly limited to functioning as a currency. I can have it. I can use it as a tradable thing. I can't necessarily direct it to lots of uses the same way I can use a debt.
Yeah, so basically one solar coin is one DECO, or the equivalent of a delivered megawatt hour?
Yeah, it's roughly equivalent. One of the things that's different about the DECO concept, or the delivered kilowatt hour, is the thinking was that would be a redeemable currency, i.e. that this thing actually represented a redeemable asset that could be claimed. Mm-hmm. With the SolarCoin, the currency is effectively just given away. And so the sole value, instead of being redeemed, is strictly from the transactional utility. In the same way that Bitcoin currently is worth, let's say, $6 billion. And if we make an estimate that there are currently, which is an optimistic estimate, 3 million users who accept it, you end up with each user, whether they're a super node on the network like an overstock.com or an individual who's got $10, each user is effectively creating, by agreeing to that protocol, the Bitcoin protocol, as money, $2,000 US. 6 billion divided by 3 million.
Right.
You can do the same math for gold. With, you say there are 5 billion people, 5 or 6 billion people out of the 7 who may accept gold upon, site. Divide it by all the gold outstanding, and you roughly end up with the same figure. You can do the same math for the euro or almost any form of, let's say, currency.
Mm-hmm. Now, the Gini index has a bit of a problem with that kind of a math there. But yeah, maybe we'll come back to discuss that a little bit later. So let me, because you said they're given away, let me ask you this. Mm-hmm. How can people get some solar coins then?
If you have solar panels on your roof, you just go to the website, solarcoin.org, or one of the partner websites, Global Solar Change or Sol Crypto in Japan. Fill in a form, takes 5 minutes, and you download a wallet, and you'll get your solar coin. Takes about 2 to 3 weeks.
That's fantastic. So basically, anyone with a solar battery on their roof or something like that can get solar coins.
Correct.
Now, how do you verify the proof of work or the fact that they have produced that amount of energy, in fact?
Correct. Right now, what's going on is that is being done on a continuum of, let's say, ease of use versus the size of claim. If you show up and claim a significant amount of these things, we'll want very, very robust verification. It could be, pictures of the system, some of the nameplate capacity, even a direct link into the inverter meter as they're being generated for a large farm. The individual, because there's a lot less at stake per se, literally the individual can just send in name, address of the facility, and then either a link to their solar energy generation report or even an image of the inverter. So the thinking is we want to make it as easy as possible right now. The good news is we're talking with partners and data partners so that if you have one of these panels on your roof, you may have a company that installed it and they may monitor it. So we are looking for actively these monitoring companies to talk to them to make it automatic.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely fantastic. Now, perhaps now is the time, though, to bring the point of the Gini index here, because I know SolarCoin is considerably different than Bitcoin, but some of the problems that people had with Bitcoins, that's like notables, like, for example, Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman, or one of my favorite science fiction authors, Charlie Stross.
Yeah, he's great.
Bitcoin should die and burn in a fire or something like that.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons that he was quoting was the Gini index, and that's the fact that a handful of people control and own the vast majority of Bitcoins today. Now, so I don't want to get distracted about the Bitcoin Gini index, but bringing that kind of a conversation into the solar coin in light of the most recent, for example, solar plant coming online in the next little bit in Morocco, for example, which can obviously put huge claims on solar coins and therefore perhaps obtain a large chunk of all the coins in circulation. How is that going to impact the sort of the distribution of money into the system?
Correct. The distribution, I'll unpack some of the issues. First of all, the Gini coefficient, which is effectively plotting the distribution of holders against the relative amounts held. To the degree that you are on one of the extremes of the Gini coefficient, which runs from 0 to 1, 0 being everyone is equal, 1 being everything held by an individual, neither of those extremes is functional for an economy. Neither one represents, let's say, how nature works or distributes resources very effectively. What's typically found in macroeconomics is that there are Gini coefficients that are closer, and the more egalitarian, you typically have more stable, robust economies. You also have, this will sound strange, happier people living there and functional. So
and less violence-prone societies.
Correct. And so, I don't want to get deep into the issue of inequity or inequality, but what you do find is, let's just say this, some of the Scandinavian countries have very low Gini coefficients and extremely high quality of life.
Absolutely.
And that's an area that I think is important for the debate in terms of framing it around what's it all about? It's less about inequality, and it's more about, is a society functioning well for everyone? It just happens that a more equal society gets that result, and so that's very important. Absolutely. In SolarCoin, first of all, we don't really address that directly, and I'll explain how we kind of try to, but we can't social engineer things too much. The SolarCoin Foundation's goal is maintain parity, 1 megawatt circulation relative to 1 megawatt hour distributed. To that end, the following happens. If a retail individual signs up, great, they get their coins. If a large farm like this institution in Morocco signs up, there have been discussions of putting a tax of potentially 10% on those coins and then using it for the distribution and development of the currency itself. But it's got to be very simple and very transparent. So that's how we're trying to resolve that. It will not, and SolarCoin in and of itself will not resolve the issues of monetary or cultural iniquity. Its mandate is strictly to incentivize solar energy. Now, I will explain this, though. The reason we looked at, and there was deep research into other renewables, wind, geothermal, even wave, et cetera, nuclear. If you look at all these forms of energy, solar is the most distributed. There's 7 million people out there. If this was WindCoin, you'd have a handful of large financial institutions that would get coins, and you'd have a network of 200 participants. So we're looking at distributing this more. The other thing I can say is that the 7 million participants today, the solar industry is growing at 20 to 30% a year. Costs are on this cost performance curve ratio I mentioned earlier. So what'll happen is in 10 years, you might have 70, 80, 100 million people participating to the degree that they all require a consumed amount of energy. And as that energy gets more and more distributed, as it gets cheaper for the individual versus a central network, you'll probably have a flattening of our effective Gini coefficient. But that's speculation. Long answer to your question.
No, and it's a great answer. And in defense of SolarCoin, I have to say that in contrast to Bitcoin, I can be a lot more sympathetic here with such a kind of distribution. The reason being is that the bottom line is here that we have the production of solar energy.
Correct.
It means it fulfills its purpose, and that's a benefit to the society in general, without the negative externality associated with the other form of energy, such as coal or nuclear, etc.
Correct. And to juxtapose us with Bitcoin, one of Charlie Strauss's critiques, in many critiques, is Bitcoin is a huge carbon generator. There's some math on our site that shows the transaction, if Bitcoin is at full transaction capacity, each transaction on the Bitcoin network takes 119 kilowatt hours. Now that's a huge amount of energy, and it's effectively useless. A lot of people confuse the proof of work that's done for the consensus, and they confuse it with actually doing something productive. It's actually a sunk cost. SolarCoin just moved 4 or 5 months ago to a new algorithm called a proof of stake, et cetera, et cetera. It is 200 to 300 times more efficient, and so we estimate that when our network, should it reach the same size as Bitcoin's, let's say 1.5, 2 million people, you will be able to process a transaction instead of at 100 kilowatt hours, which is, let's say, Bitcoin's, at less than 0.1 kilowatt hours with SolarCoin. So it's a green currency that is designed from the ground up to be distributed and use its externalities to stimulate green energy production.
Very good. I like it very much. So it works on both ends of the equation. On the one end, it diminishes energy consumption. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, it incentivizes clean energy production.
Correct. And to put that energy consumption of Bitcoin into perspective, if you imagine the current Bitcoin mining reward, you may hear about these miners, right?
Yeah.
Currently, the rewards every year are worth about, let's say, $400 million. Okay, that means people are most likely willing to spend up to $400 million to get those rewards. There's a marginal cost benefit, right?
Yeah.
Well, the mix of that cost is going to be a mix of electricity to do the mining, and then chips, ASIC chips, and all the rest. Well, to produce an ASIC chip takes energy as well. There's embedded energy and information in this thing. So effectively, you have $400 million worth of information chasing, to competing to keep this network up in what's called a red queen race. Nobody really wins. The network, adjusts, and so it's the same solution. You're just resolving a block. It just gets harder or less hard. So it's $400 million worth of energy, if you will, combined in the embedded energy in an ASIC or a produced thing, and the electricity that's not doing much for anybody. It's carbon in the air.
By the way, that sense, it's like gold. It's really useless in its own.
Correct. The way gold works is if you view the gold currency as a network, and effectively every node on the network is participating in the currency. If you go out and mine gold, what you're doing is effectively you're spending energy to buy your way into the network. The same way with Bitcoin, you're spending energy to buy your way into the network. It works exact opposite with SolarCoin. You generate solar electricity, you get to join the network.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I like SolarCoin so much, and which is why I wanted to bring you here to tell us about all those differences. So now, let me ask you about another difference now here. Most recently, there were a lot of waves made by an article by Mike Hearn called Resolution of the Bitcoin Experiment, where he said that basically Bitcoin was an experiment, and in his opinion, it has failed. And one of the reasons that he quotes is the fact that the packet size has almost reached its ultimate limit, or approximately.
Correct.
So let me ask you, how is the packet size of SolarCoin similar or different than I think it's a 1 megabyte limit on Bitcoin?
Correct. I'm going to unpack your statement in a few levels. First of all, I'll start with that experiment. Almost everything is an experiment. And this is true. Even there's a fantastic book I'd recommend to your readers called The Half-Life of Facts. I know the author. Every fact, scientific fact, has a half-life. In physics, it's 13 years. The reason being our measurements get better or the fact gets overturned. In the science of economics, the half-life of facts is about 3 years. It's a sloppy field. So physics is the most robust. So we live in a hypothesis-driven world. Everything's going to fail, eventually, or be disproved by a better model of understanding. I go now to Bitcoin. We say, all right, that was an experiment. So it begs the question of what was the experiment? If the experiment was to create value with a network, okay, that's worked. If it was to topple or replace currencies, as some people think the experiment was, no, you just created a new thing. I'm now going to go into the second issue of blockchain size. The other interesting aspect of Bitcoin as an experiment is the underlying tech, the blockchain, has spawned solutions and successors, right? Anyone can launch another chain and say, look, I've got Litecoin, I've got Mega Bitcoin, or whatever, and they can put their blocks at whatever size they want. So has Bitcoin failed? The thing is, there are lots of solutions to the problem. And I'm not going to get into the technical aspects of some of them because, frankly, they're more technical and others can do better justice in. But whether it's a side chain, an off-chain transaction that gets resolved, there are ways of resolving the issue. So the interesting...
Mike did say that there are ways of resolving the issue, but he said the incentives right now is that the few miners are disincentivized to adopt those changes, one. And two, they have a disproportionate amount of power, so they can actually block the change.
Correct. Like 50% of the mining is done in China, and there are probably a couple of groups. And this happens in networks where there's a convergence of power and effectively to a centralized source. And this is one of Bitcoin's challenges is... the reward mechanism, originally it was very, very distributed, right? Anybody with a PC could try and mine these things. Eventually, you had only the people who had...
Now it's impossible.
Exactly. You have to have the cheapest power because it's economies of scale.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden, now that limits Bitcoin for a few reasons. The network can't grow. In essence, the number of people claiming rewards shrinks.
Smaller and smaller and
smaller and smaller. So then you just have to have people on the network who buy in for other reasons, substitute currency. The cool thing with SolarCoin is the network grows. As the value of the currency grows, it becomes a greater incentive for more people to claim it and grow the network. It's something we call the autocatalytic effect. We're assuming that the network goes autocatalytic in terms of a self-perpetuating reaction, if you will, at about the $1 price point. that's the price point of the coin, where the average person with something on the roof says, yeah, I'll give this a try for $20, $20 or $30 US, or 20 or 30 euros. That autocatalytic point in terms of our network theory of money is roughly between 20 to 50,000 users.
Mm-hmm. So, and what's the size of the packet you're using there?
The packet, I'm going to go back. Sorry, thank you for keeping me on question. Much appreciated. I believe we currently have the 1 megabyte packet. Now, that's a packet limit, a max limit. Right now, there are very few transactions going across. And I'm going to explain.
So it's the same size as Bitcoin?
Same size as Bitcoin, but there's one distinct difference. We resolve a block every 10 minutes. So effectively, we have 10 times the capacity of Bitcoin. Bitcoin's theoretical capacity is 7 transactions a second. Our theoretical transaction capacity would be 70 transactions per second.
So perhaps that's going to give you, let's say, 10 times longer before you reach the point of saturation. Then what?
Well, yeah, also, the other thing is, to the degree that there are these other solutions out there, we can also increase the size, the block size, and we're actually looking at doing a hard fork. And in the near future, because we have a small network, it's a fairly easy thing to do, and probably increasing it by a factor of 5.
Yeah, that was my point. That's exactly my point.
Correct. And the reason we can do that is because the interests of the people are all aligned. The Bitcoin problem is all of a sudden you have technology that's misaligned with a group of social interests, and so it's getting stuck. Now,
you actually have in Bitcoin, you have basically relativistic gain. You have
yes, exactly.
Instead of
absolute
a growing pie, you have a kind of a oh my God, prisoner's dilemma kind of.
Yeah, well, it's kind of a prisoner's dilemma. The other word or phrasing it's given in ecology and the environment is called the Red Queen race. Yeah, everyone has to run faster, but they're still staying the same. You use the correct term. It's a relative race. Everyone throws more resources to mine, et cetera, but the end result is pretty much the same. The network is resolving blocks and moving on.
Yeah, and it's about relative gains. It's about those few miners who want to consolidate and not risk in any way their already established position.
Correct.
Control versus the majority of the rest of the Bitcoin users who have the incentives to actually keep growing.
Correct. And if we escalate up to thinking about innovation as an evolving system, the rule is always the following. It's about flow and dynamics of flow and complexity. Innovation, evolution, always end runs obstructions. So if Bitcoin gets stuck, there will be a substitute. There will be some innovation that will just ignore and move on. That won't mean that Bitcoin dies. It just means that something will most likely be bigger or take the opportunity to do it right. Whether that's another coin, another tech, who knows?
Yeah, and exactly, it would just the next thing would just adopt the successful features of Bitcoin and drop the failure features, and that's why actually maybe 2 years ago I wrote an article called the financial singularity is here, where I argued that I don't know if Bitcoin the money will be successful or not, but I think that the Bitcoin technology, that's to say the blockchain behind, is here to stay in one form or another.
Definitely. The blockchain tech is profoundly interesting. For those who are deep into the philosophical aspects of computation, you've got something that only exists as a logical construct and not a physical one, which is very profound. And then obviously you have Ethereum, where effectively you're creating really a database of stored procedures, but kind of a computer that, again, doesn't exist anywhere physically because it's distributed, but it's a logical construct of consensus, which is a very, very wild concept, and a machine like the internet that can't be shut down, or most likely won't be.
Yeah, actually, there's a few interesting sort of altcoins or offshoots of the Bitcoin and blockchain technology. And the two most interesting to me so far that I'm aware of are Ethereum, and I've interviewed Vitalik Buterin. And
oh, yeah, brilliant guy.
With you, yeah, Vitalik is a brilliant kid. I'm just like fascinated. I've met him a few times, and he's just.
Yeah. We're in talks with them to help with the electric chain project. So SolarCoin may be the data layer, but there'll be lots of needs for smarts on top for people to report data. So we're chasing Ethereum and a few others to help that project because it's global open science. But keep going. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So
Fantastic.
what was the other altcoin you were interested in, Nicola?
Ether and Solar, right?
Okay.
Because Ether is the Ethereum coin.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So Ether and the SLR is the
Yep.
Solar coin. Now, tell us a little bit more again about the rate of adoption. You said you still have a small network, and which is why I kind of suggested that perhaps now is the time to consider those problems, because it's easier to make the changes of the pack size, etc. While it's
Correct.
smaller. But how small or how big is it now?
We are talking a tiny network. We probably have between 300 to 500 users. And that's interesting. We've been in beta, and the phasing of the technology has been the following. First, get the technology robust, figure out the core mechanics. 2016, we launched in 2014. 2016 is the year of scale. So we've gone out to our affiliates in various countries, and we're going to start partnering with inverter manufacturers, large developers. And so we're looking at potentially growing the network. Our goal is probably 100x. But I will just say this: we have connections to very, very interesting people in, let's say, Reuters Energy, Bloomberg New Energy Finance, a lot of high-end groups. So once we get the infrastructure ready for claimants to be processed in an automated way, which will happen in a month or two, we'll be growing the network many orders of magnitude. So the base and the platform is in place, and that will probably impact price, would be my guess. But I'll let people come to the conclusion on their own.
I would imagine Elon Musk and SolarCity would be some of the people you'd be talking to.
We were just talking to someone who is 1 degree of separation away from him. So, to the degree that he would be interested in that, and this is an individual who may be leading our electric chain initiative. He's one group. The reality is the autocatalytic inflection point, we need 20 to 50,000 users. SolarCity currently has 200,000 users, and they're targeting 900,000. So obviously it would be a huge step change function in the network, and interesting. I think we need to grow to get there, but would love to start those conversations.
Yeah, sounds absolutely fascinating. I wish you good luck. Maybe I can throw in a request too. Is if you get to Elon, if you could just mention that I've been trying to get him on my show for the last couple of years. That's very nice.
No problems. If we get the time with him, sure.
and he can watch this fascinating interview with you as one of many to prove that his time will be well spent.
There we go.
Anyway, okay, so the other kind of interesting little detail is that the smallest unit of SolarCoin is called the photon.
Exactly. This is the great thing is about open community is, and in a community that's less focused on money and more on social good and solar energies, they're very fun and creative. And so one of our community members came up with that. So we're the photon versus the Satoshi.
Now, tell us, we've covered sort of the currency and sort of the mechanics behind it. Perhaps now is the time to tell us a little more about the SolarCoin Foundation and how does it fit within the bigger picture?
Sure. The SolarCoin Foundation is a little bit like the Bitcoin Foundation, but hopefully more functional.
I hope so.
Let's say stable. It has only one mandate, and all it does is try to maintain the integrity of the 1 megawatt hour to 1 SLR issuance rate. It functions a bit like a central bank in that it signals what it thinks. Let's say the interest rate policy is. It signals what it thinks the wallet should be. Obviously, as an open source project, if people launch different versions, etc. So it's really just a messaging platform, and it tries to maintain the integrity of the verification process with our affiliates. So it's meant to be very light, and it's a node on, let's say, the network of users. Right now, the SolarCoin Foundation looks like this big thing, but that's because we have a small network. Ideally, the affiliates and the participants and all the rest become bigger and more important than the foundation's role. The foundation, again, like a central bank, doesn't advertise, doesn't try to push price up, doesn't do anything. It's very quiet, and its whole message is we want the blockchain to be stable, and we want good user experience. We want, to the degree we control it, people involved to be operating legally and within the regulatory frameworks of their respective countries, and we try to signal that We want good actors.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Excellent. Okay, so I think we covered pretty much the basics of SolarCoin.
Sure.
Give us, just before we move on to some other topics, give us what's the best place for people to go and search for more information on that topic.
Sure. They can go to solarcoin.org, all one word. They can go to solarchange.co. Or they can go to Sol Crypto. This is our Japanese affiliate, SOL Crypto, CRYPTO .com.
Excellent. Okay. Now, let me ask you for to sort of bring our conversation in a few other realms here.
Sure.
Because as I said, you have a fascinating background, and I want to get your opinion here.
Okay.
Just one interesting thing is, what's your take generally on nuclear power, and in general, and perhaps you can even comment most recently on the brand new sort of revelation for a leak at Indian Point a couple of days ago.
Sure. Obviously, that's highly local, so it is topical. Nuclear power is very, very interesting. Interesting in that it's clean, etc. My only concerns about it are risk and how the safety engineering is done. And I have an article on my blog which is about the Indian Point reactor, and basically. I've done a lot of work with risk, right? I've done risk analysis for trillion-dollar banks. Blah, blah, blah. I testified in front of the U.S. Senate as a Y2K risk expert, world's largest technology expert. I was, one of 7 guys. The other guys were from the World Bank, the DoD, CIA, blah blah blah, State Department. Okay, so I'm a risk guy, and I'm a big risk guy, big picture risk guy. I look at nuclear, and I think a lot of the safety engineering isn't done very effectively. That's my biggest concern with it. It's not a bias. The science is the science. I'm worried more about how the safety engineering and that philosophy is done. And I'll give you an example. This is from my blog article. If I design something with a 1 in 100,000 year failure rate, a lot of people feel safe or comfortable with that. It's 1 in 100,000. If, however, I acknowledge the fact that that thing is going to be in operation for, let's say, 100 years, then all of a sudden I have a 1 in 1,000 chance of that thing going wrong. That's the fundamental problem that's used, or the fundamental flaw in designing these systems is the way they're measuring safety is on an annual basis as opposed to the lifetime of the operation of the thing. It's like the easy example I give to people is if you go buy a house on the river and the guy says, hey, I'll sell you the house. It lives on a floodplain and there's a chance of a flood, once in 100 years. So you look over at your wife and, and say, hey, once in 100 years, let's take the chance. Your wife looks back and says, well, we're going to live here for 30 years. Right? That's 3 out of 10. You're not so comfortable. So it's important to think in that risk. And I've given lectures at NASA and the Singularity University actually on measuring risk correctly in natural systems. So that's my bias. That's my take on nuclear. It's interesting, but the safety engineering needs to be more robust and thought.
Yeah, it would seem so, especially in light of the revelations that perhaps the Fukushima disaster was even worse than anything we've had beforehand.
Correct. I mean, I don't know the exact nature of the failures or the exact nature of the impact. And that'll be, the full thing will probably be known years out. But it was a huge disaster. Again, one of the reasons that, from a purely a security perspective, light distributed, decentralized forms of energy, light distributed systems of all kinds work. From a pure security engineering or risk engineering, the more centralized the thing is, the more tightly coupled the elements, the more brittle and failure prone. Because if there's a single failure, it cascades out. So you want a light distributed network of things, whatever it is, whether it's a banking system or an energy system.
Right. Very good point. Yes, absolutely. Now, let me ask you this, though. Mm-hmm. What kind of car do you drive?
After that safety lecture, you like this. I drive an old Volvo. Volvo station wagon. I have a young daughter, and so we have 2 Volvo station wagons.
That's very fascinating. Yeah. I bet it has something to do with your risk assessment.
Safety. I'm a safety conscious guy. Those are my priorities. First, get there safe, do whatever. Then you can do whatever you want, but think about things in advance.
Wow, very interesting. Okay. Now, another question, though, is what's your take? Are you meat eater?
Yeah.
You are?
Yeah. and acknowledge that has terrible environmental impact, and I don't know about the health aspects. So, but what's your question? And Nikolai interrupted.
The question is this, though. You have a very ethical and noble goal by releasing SolarCoin. That's to say, incentivize the production of clean energy.
Right.
At a sort of diminishing cost and at zero to very low negative externalities, be it to the environment, be it to anything else. And that's, of course, going to have positive effect on global warming.
Hopefully.
Now, here's the connection, though. The UN came with a report that transportation and energy costs are somewhere maybe around, if I remember, in the 18% of all the causes adding up to global warming.
Okay.
And maybe 50 or more than maybe 51% are related to agricultural sector and especially to meat production.
Correct. Methane releases have a very, very high impact as a climate, a warming gas. Correct.
So the sort of the bumper line for that is that a vegan or a vegetarian driving a Hummer is much less negatively impacting the environment than a meat eater with a bicycle.
Right. That could be very true. Yeah.
So and especially since there's even a documentary on the topic recently that I watched, and I haven't done the background checks on it yet. It's called Cowspiracy. It's kind of getting to be very popular.
Okay.
Where they said that even if we convert all the energy on the planet, given the rates of increase in meat consumption and the associated requirements of land and the exhaustion of the Amazon forest, whether directly to raise cattle or to raise food for cattle, such as soy and corn and stuff, we are still going to be much worse off than before if we continue on our obsession with meat. And the other point is that, of course, the developing world, as they're becoming more and more developed, they develop a taste for meat. So China is eating more meat than ever before.
Correct.
So is India, and so is everyone else. As they're getting richer, they want to consume more meat.
Correct. The meat protein consumption scales probably proportionally with GDP directly, and so you can assume that relationship will hold. Solving that problem, or let's say mitigating it, you could try it with a carbon tax to price things relative to their externalities. If we assume there's a negative externality associated with meat, that's a potential solution. The other solutions may be, and it sounds extremely futuristic, but who knows? Alternative forms of meat.
3D printed meat.
Potentially, yeah. I mean,
I've interviewed Dr. Gabor Forgac on that topic from Organovo.
Correct. And it sounds extremely theoretical and out there, but it's not that far away. I mean, the research we were doing at Star Lab, one of the things we were looking at was how do you grow an artificial liver? And a liver is a very complicated structure with the structure of the hepatic cells, et cetera, defines its function. Growing that or growing other organs or muscle tissue could be a potential solution. And I don't know what the trajectory on that technology is, but that might be there. I mean, I acknowledge what you're saying about the potential problem and the degree that economics will drive. You have these two forces, economics and technology, will drive what happens.
Yeah, and let me just share with you sort of my evolution on that per se. Okay. So I totally hope, as you are, that 3D printed meat will be here sooner rather than later. My concern is whether it's going to be here on time. And then as per meat consumption specifically, I eat meat myself, but I've started decreasing it tremendously in the last couple of months, and I'm going to start trying having meat once a week or something like that.
Right.
And the reasoning behind is twofold. So one is like ethically speaking, and my blog is not about technology. My blog is actually about ethics. Technology is just the context. Because technology is amoral, but the choices we make with it make it either moral or immoral.
Correct.
And so I have problems, personally speaking, with sort of the farming industry, the industrialization of meat production and stuff like that on one hand, and the ethical treatment of those living organisms which are capable of suffering on the one hand. And on the other hand, purely selfishly, the negative impact of that industry on the planet and therefore on me and our species. So, that's kind of the motivation for me to diminish meat consumption as much as possible. Now, and that kind of also connects to a point that you brought about carbon tax, which is kind of a direction I wanted to bring our conversation a little bit. Not necessarily with respect to carbon tax, but what some people have called true cost economics.
Correct. Familiar with and there's actually true cost carbon, which is but yes.
Exactly. So one of the easiest examples that kind of blows my mind is that if you go and buy a water bottle from a convenience store, to hold that one, let's say, unit of water into the bottle, you must use 7 or 8 units of water to hold 1 unit of water in the production of that plastic bottle itself.
Correct. The energy and material intensity behind a lot of things is profoundly surprising. The best way to make an estimate of the carbon intensity or energy intensity of anything is to look at its price. And this is very interesting. I'm going to go there. This floors a lot of people. If Wired did a good magazine on lithium battery cars, etc. If I want to try to understand the carbon footprint of a car, one of the easiest ways to do it is just to look at the price of the components. So even if I have a electric car, the early ones, they're getting better all the time, so they're going to make a lot more sense. But the early ones, they were really, really expensive. And on the one hand, you felt good about the electric car. What you were effectively doing was you were consuming a huge amount of energy, which showed up in the price, to mine lithium. Now it's getting more efficient and better, and so the car's on the production curve where it'll become, let's say, sensible and carbon positive. But the original ones were terrible. And so one way to understand the, let's say, the material impact or the energy impact of anything, the easiest way to do is look at the price or the cost of it. And that will tell you about its intensity. So you look at the cost of bottled water, it's more than gasoline these days. it's a crazy thing, right? I mean,
but the concern here is that it does the actual nominal cost that you pay in the store does not reflect the actual damage on the environment, because you have hidden costs that you don't pay for.
Correct. These are the externalities, and this is one of the. I'm actually working on a project, a fintech startup, that's working on making it easier for people to invest in, because they're aware of these externalities. Because this is where economics fails. I mean, you have capitalism. It's great for innovation, blah blah blah. How it's managed in terms of equity and equitable distributions of outcomes is a question, a large one. And then the other thing is, it fails. Capitalism has a lot of information failures. The tragedy of the commons being the classic one, where I create an externality, a risk, a cost, an impact that's borne by others. And I look at that and I say it's an information failure. So the question is, how do we solve that? You either solve it with sending information back by increasing the price to reflect the externalities, or regulation that says, okay, this thing can or can't happen. So we've taken a thing, we've assigned it a label that says this doesn't work, so you assign it information that it's a good or a bad thing. So agreed, framing the problem as externalities, acknowledging them, and then starting to quantify them will help first people make conscious choices, and then if there are policy decisions to be made, make them. It's a very tough world, though, because the externalities are often, they're either spread out geographically, so they're tough to measure over space, and then time, right? Climate change is a classic worst-case scenario where the impact is spread out decades in the future and then across to everyone, and so very few people feel they own the problem. These are interesting challenges to me. I mean, they are the challenges, of our age, and across multiple dimensions. So climate change will be one. Biodiversity and some of the things that will be in genetic technology will be another one. That'll be in the future. The concepts of privacy for individuals and individual data, and even data security. These are things that, as we become more and more digital, will become major issues. Mm-hmm. Sorry, I went off on a tangent there, but I thought it's my framework.
No, I totally agree with you. But so the question then is, can capitalism provide the framework to resolve those problems? Or is it the case, as Einstein said, that the kind of thinking that got you into a problem cannot be the kind of thinking that takes you out of it. So,
I think I write in my book actually that on one extreme, if you have pure capitalism, you end up having an extreme failed state. If you have pure capitalism, it's only those who have the most power that control things. And so people who say, I'm an extreme
the winner
libertarian.
takes it all.
The winner takes it all, and ultimately, if there are no laws, if there isn't regulation, do you have pure capitalism in, let's say, Somalia or South Sudan, where you have a failed state?
Absolutely.
It's pure power and it's pure capitalism. So what people are really, sorry about that, what people really want is regulated capitalism, because many of the information failures in capitalism or the concepts of a more equitable society require that it's not driven by pure absolute power or one individual's needs versus the society. So pure capitalism won't solve it. Well-regulated capitalism that has the space to innovate will. So you don't want a state actor that controls and dominates anything, so you don't get the wonders of innovation and incentives on the one extreme. But on the other hand, you can't have the Wild West, because you'll get abuses of power. So navigating that is literally every country's and every polity's constant debate.
Absolutely, yeah. And going back to your previous example, I think the Scandinavian countries have the best track record so far on being able to.
They've show up very well on a lot of metrics, right? If you look at if you ever look at the site Nation Master, which I would recommend people take a look at, you can compare countries on hedonics, happiness, quality of life, life expectancy, many metrics of what people call what's a successful society. And you'll see that their organizational principles and systems seem to provide that, and for the long run.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
you think that capitalism is here to stay, in other words?
Inevitably, because if I look at it, it's an adaptive learning. If we look at an economy, is nothing more than how people determine how to do two things: share resources and innovate and adapt. Capitalism is nothing more than a way of trying to figure out and resolve that. So it's going to exist, whether it's two guys trading shells on an island to try to optimize their own individual outcomes, or global multinationals. The question is, how is it regulated and how is it managed? So that there aren't, you want to minimize externalities so that there's good actors. So you need regulations, whether it's for safety or for some other things. And how do you minimize, abuses of power? And every society has to resolve that on their own. So capitalism isn't going anywhere. I think it'll be here. It's almost always been here in one form or another. Even societies that said they weren't capitalistic have inherently, at some part, wherever they are on a spectrum that I mentioned earlier, have always had feedback, innovation, and some form of reward mechanism for that innovation or getting things done.
Defined in that way, I can totally agree with you. Yes, yes. Even in a situation like me growing up in communist Bulgaria, there were those elements there. Absolutely
correct. There's always somebody who's hustling, right, to do something or make a shortcut, because a purely hierarchical architected system is too brittle. If it's too centralized, it's too brittle, and so there's always evolution at the edges, or adaptation, or somebody doing something.
Absolutely. Okay, so maybe, and that's a very hard thing to ask, but can you give us like the scoop on what's your take on the technological singularity in general and AI in particular?
I think, well, I'm going to go meta on you. One of the most interesting places to look for that information is accelerating.org. They have a very interesting take. The most profound concepts of, let's say, evolution and trajectory for things is a philosophy put forth by Eric J. Chason in his book Cosmic Evolution. And I will also recommend the book Into the Cool by Dorian Sagan, who is Dorian Sagan, who is Carl Sagan's son. Now, those books explain the trajectory of evolution across domains. When I say across domains, there's geographic, biological, ecological, or let's say economy, us, and then post-economic. So yes, the singularity will be here. Chason has a great paper that he defines. There have already been 5 or 6 singularities in terms of points of inflection point where evolution crossed a threshold. The move from biology, or I'm sorry, pure, let's say, geology, into biology. Biology then evolving into cultural, techno-social culture we have, and then the technical culture. And my argument is the singularity is already here in the fact that every step change across an ecological domain, let's say the biological to the economic to the post-economic, where the singularity lives, every step change sees symbiosis as the evolution point, and symbiosis means dependency on a thing. So we can't shut down our machines right now and survive. No urban city could survive if you shut down the internet and the energy infrastructure behind it. So we're already in the singularity. Our dependence on technology is such that we are already symbiotic and co-symbiotic with our technology. The degree to which the technology becomes self-directed is emerging faster and faster. And whether that's your car, I mean, one great debate I think you should have is the ethics, programming ethics into machines. Driverless cars will have to do that, right? You have a driverless car, and you're going to have what they call the thrown switch problem. You're going to hit one person, or you're going to save 5 people. You have to make a choice. Every driverless car is going to have ethics programmed into it. That's interesting.
Absolutely. Yes. And you gave us a few other very interesting topics of future interviews and people, by the way, which I appreciate very much.
Sure.
So, Nick, the second last question I always ask is, where can people find more about you personally and your work?
Check out the website, I guess, The Nature of Value, read that book. Or they could go to my website. I don't post much there. But Gogerty.com, which is my last name. There's some thinking on Ethereum, Ether, the singularity, a concept called dead capital, which is a very interesting opportunity for development globally. We can talk about that in another lecture. And that talks about a failure of organizational capitalism. It's like a $9 trillion opportunity. That's probably about it.
Yeah, and I can vouch. I've been to all those places and read most of those things. Okay. You do cover a variety of interesting topics, diverse topics, and I recommend people check that out very much. So.
Thank you.
So, Nick, we covered a whole spectrum of topics today.
Right.
What, in your opinion, is the best way to wrap up our conversation? What's the sort of parting message you want to send us with?
I think the parting message is... think in networks and think adaptation. Recognize that everything has a trajectory that it's on, whatever is static, it's on an improving, fast-moving trajectory. And so try to understand your world from where internet networks are going to intersect and where technology's trajectories are, or are headed, I guess, because everything's getting faster.
Think in networks and think in adaptation. I like that very much. Nick Gogerty, thank you very much for being with us today.
All right. Thank you, Nicola.
If you guys enjoyed this show, you can help me make it better in a couple of ways. You can go and write a review on iTunes, or you can simply make a donation.
Singularity.